The meeting was already over. He just didn't know it yet. A man from the regional bank stood at the front of the co-op hall. His tie a little too tight for the dry September heat. He spoke of deferrals, of restructuring, of emergency federal loans. His words were smooth, practiced, designed to sound like help. To the 20 farmers sitting in the metal folding chairs, it sounded like the last rites. Dust motes danced in the long columns of afternoon light cutting through the tall, wavy glass of the windows. Outside, the world was the color of cardboard. The fields, the dirt roads, the very air itself seemed bleached of life. For 2 years, the rain had forgotten this part of the country. The man from the bank finished his presentation with a sad, professional smile. He asked for questions. No one spoke. The silence was the answer. It was a heavy, airless thing, the kind of quiet that follows a rockslide. Finally, a farmer in the back, a man named Miller who worked 3,000 acres of corn and soy, stood up. He wasn't asking a question. He was making a statement. He buttoned the front of his worn denim jacket, a gesture of finality. "We appreciate you coming down," he said. "But we all know the score. We're all in the same boat." A few heads nodded. The rustle of worn fabric and the scrape of a boot on the concrete floor were the only sounds. "The boat," he continued, "is taking on water." A murmur of agreement. Then, from the side of the room, a single voice, quiet but clear, cut through the tired air. "Not everyone." The words hung there. They were not loud. They were not angry. They were a simple statement of fact, and for that, they were more disruptive than a shout. Every head in the room turned. Sarah Croft sat by herself, a few chairs away from the others. She hadn't moved. Her hands, weathered and clean, rested on her knees. Her work boots were laced tight. There was a faint line of pale dust on the cuffs of her jeans. She looked at Miller, her expression unreadable. Miller, a man accustomed to being the center of any room he occupied, frowned. His confidence was the largest thing about him, larger than his considerable frame, larger than his 3,000 acres. He did not like being contradicted, especially not quietly. "What's that, Sarah?" he asked, his voice laced with the kind of strained patience one uses for a child. "I said," she repeated, her voice even, not rising, not falling. "Not everyone is in the same boat." A few of the men exchanged glances. Sarah Croft had kept to herself since her husband, Tom, had passed 5 years back. She worked their small quarter section, just 160 acres, and mostly kept her own counsel. She was seen as quiet, stubborn, maybe a little strange. The bank attorney, who had been packing his briefcase, paused. He looked from Miller to Sarah, his professional curiosity piqued. This was an unexpected variable. Miller gave a short, dismissive laugh. It was not a sound of humor. It was a sound of correction. "Sarah, we've all got eyes. We've seen the fields. We've all seen the dust blow. There isn't a man in this room who isn't hurting." He gestured around the hall, a politician rallying his base. "We're all praying for rain. We're all facing the same disaster." He was wrong. The disaster was not the same for everyone. The disaster had been selective. It had punished the confident and spared the patient. Sarah said nothing more. She didn't need to. Her 5 words had already done the work. They had introduced a new and unwelcome idea into the room. That this failure was not an act of God, shared by all, but a matter of choice, and that someone had chosen differently. The room went quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was a thinking silence, a questioning silence. The men were no longer looking at the banker. They were looking at the small woman in the clean work shirt, and then, in their minds, they were looking at her fields. To understand why, you have to go back 5 years. Back to the winter after Tom died. The farmhouse was too quiet. The silence had a physical weight to it. For weeks, Sarah moved through the rooms as if underwater, her motions slow, her thoughts muffled. The farm was hers now, but it felt like his. His boots were still by the door. His favorite mug was still on the second shelf. His notebooks were in a cardboard box in the small room he used as an office. One night, unable to sleep, she carried the box to the kitchen table. The snow was falling outside, thick and silent, blanketing the dead fields. She made a pot of coffee and opened the first notebook. Tom's handwriting was a familiar, slanted script. For hours she read. He had documented everything. Planting dates, rainfall totals, fertilizer costs, yield per bushel, commodity prices going back 20 years. It was a meticulous record of a slow, grinding defeat. The numbers told a clear story. The soil was giving them less each year, and they were spending more to get it. The fertilizer inputs went up. The pesticide costs went up. The fuel costs went up. But the yields were flat, and in the dry years they fell. They were running faster just to stay in the same place. She found what she was looking for in a notebook from 1978, the year he graduated from the State Agricultural College. Tucked into a back pocket was a thin pamphlet from the University Extension Service. Its title was Building Soil, not just mining it. Inside, Tom had underlined passages with a red pen. He had made notes in the margins. The pamphlet talked about the life under the ground. It talked about organic matter, about microbial activity, about water retention. And it talked about cover crops: hairy vetch, crimson clover, cereal rye, tillage radish. Plants you grew not to harvest, but to feed the soil. You planted them in the fall after the corn or soy came off. They grew through the winter, their roots holding the soil in place, preventing the wind and water erosion that stole your most valuable asset. In the spring, you plowed them under. They decomposed, returning nitrogen and organic matter to the ground. It was an old idea, but one that had been forgotten in the age of cheap chemical fertilizers. In the margin, Tom had written a single note. Dad said no. Too expensive. No immediate return. Madness to plant something you don't sell. His father, a man of his time, had seen the farm as a factory floor. You put in inputs, you got out outputs. The soil was just a medium, a thing to be used. Tom had wanted to try. He had argued for it. But his father had been unmovable, and later, the pressure from neighbors like Miller, who farmed big and clean, had kept him from experimenting. It was easier to do what everyone else was doing. It was safer. Sarah closed the notebook. The kitchen was cold. The coffee had gone lukewarm in her mug. She looked out the window at the snow covering the hard, frozen ground. She thought of Tom's tired face after a long day, the way he would rub the back of his neck and stare out at the fields. A look of worry etched around his eyes. He knew the land was tired. He knew they were taking more than they were giving back. In that moment, she made a decision. It was not a business decision. It was a promise. She would do what he had not been able to. She would try. She would start small. There was a 40-acre parcel at the back of the property, the one they called the North 40. The soil was the poorest there, clay-heavy and compacted. Tom had always said it was more trouble than it was worth. That's where she would begin. She would plant something for the next man. Or, in this case, for the man who was gone. The decision was the easy part. The work was slow. It was 5 years of quiet, methodical effort that no one saw and no one understood. The first spring, she bought the seed herself from a small supplier 2 counties over. She didn't go to the local co-op. She didn't want the questions. She didn't want the advice. She especially didn't want the laughter. She spent a week in the farm's workshop, getting the old seed drill working again, the small one Tom's father had bought in the 1960s and left to rust in the back of the barn. It was too small for their main fields, but it was perfect for her experiment. That fall, after she harvested the meager soybean crop from the North 40, she seeded it with a mix of winter rye and hairy vetch. Miller, driving by on the county road, saw her. He stopped his truck, a new, gleaming diesel behemoth, and watched her on her old, small tractor. He rolled down his window as she finished a pass near the fence line. "Planting a little late, aren't you, Sarah?" he called out, a smirk in his voice. "Just putting the field to bed for the winter," she had answered, not stopping, not giving him the satisfaction of an argument. He had shaken his head and driven off. The story was all over the coffee shop the next morning. Poor Sarah Croft. Grief must have gotten to her. Planting weeds in good soil. Wasting fuel, wasting seed. A damn shame. The first year, the results were not spectacular. The rye grew, a thin green carpet against the gray of late autumn. The vetch was patchy. When she terminated the cover crop in the spring and planted corn, the yield was only marginally better than the year before. But she noticed something. The soil felt different. When she dug her hands into it, it was less compacted. It crumbled more easily. Smelled richer, more alive. She recorded her observations in one of Tom's old notebooks. She wrote down her costs. She wrote down her yields. She wrote down the feeling of the soil in her hands. She did it again the next year. And the year after that. Each fall, a new cocktail of cover crops. Each spring, a slightly better result. By the third year, she didn't have to use as much nitrogen fertilizer on the North 40. The vetch and clover were fixing it in the soil for her. The corn stood taller, its leaves a deeper green. The fourth year, she expanded the program to another 80 acres. Her neighbors watched. They stopped laughing out loud. Now they just shook their heads and murmured to each other about her eccentric ways. That was the first year of the drought. The rain in July was half of normal. In August, it was less than a quarter. The fields around the county started to show the stress. The corn leaves curled in on themselves, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture. The soybeans stopped growing, their pods thin and underdeveloped. Her fields looked better. Not perfect, but better. The thick mat of cover crop residue she had left on the surface acted like a mulch, keeping the soil cooler, holding in what little moisture there was. It was an insulator against the punishing sun. Her yields that year were 20% higher than Miller's. He never mentioned it. He just bought a new, bigger planter that winter, a machine designed for maximum efficiency in a conventional tillage system. He was doubling down on the old way. He was a man who believed that any problem could be solved with more horsepower and more inputs. He saw her methods not just as wrong, but as an insult to his own. It was a rejection of the hard-won wisdom of his father and his grandfather. It was personal. This year, the second year of the drought, was different. It was worse. The spring rains never came. The summer was a relentless, baking heat. The wind blew constantly, a hot, dry breath that picked up the barren topsoil from the conventionally tilled fields and threw it into the air. The sky was often hazy with a brown dust that settled on everything, a fine grit that got in your teeth, a constant reminder of the earth turning to desert. Her farm was an island, not a lush, green paradise, but an island of resilience in a sea of brown. The cover crops, now in their fifth year of rotation across her entire farm, had transformed the soil. It was darker, richer, full of worms and life. It held water like a sponge. When the rare, brief thunderstorm did roll through, the water soaked into her land. On her neighbors' fields, the water hit the baked, compacted surface and ran off, carrying more of their precious topsoil with it into the ditches. She knew what was happening. She had seen it in the numbers in her notebook. She had felt it in the soil under her boots. But until this afternoon in the co-op hall, she had never spoken of it to anyone but Tom, in the quiet conversations she still had with him out in the fields. Back in the hall, the silence stretched. Miller's face was dark with anger. His entire worldview had been challenged by 5 quiet words. He saw it as an accusation. He took a step forward. His first argument had been an appeal to a shared fate. It had failed. Now he shifted to his second, practical economics. He spoke directly to Sarah, but his words were for the room, for the other farmers who thought the way he did. It's easy to play games on a small patch of ground, Sarah. But some of us are running a business here. A real business. We have operating loans the size of your farm's whole value. We can't afford to be throwing money away on seed that you can't sell. He pointed a thick finger at her. How much did that cover crop seed cost you? How much fuel did you burn planting it? That's money that could have gone to paying down debt. In a good year, maybe you can afford a hobby. But these aren't good years. This was the argument he had used for decades. It was the argument his father had used. It was logical. It was based on numbers. And it was completely wrong. Sarah did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She met his angry gaze with a calm one. She answered with her own numbers. My seed cost was $47 an acre. She paused. Then she delivered the counterpunch. My nitrogen fertilizer cost this year was 0. The vetch and the clover fixed all I needed. Your cost was over $150 an acre. A low murmur went through the room. Fertilizer was one of their biggest expenses, a number that had only gone up. She continued, her voice still a quiet, matter-of-fact tone. The fuel to plant the cover crop was $7 an acre. The money I saved on commercial fertilizer paid for that 20 times over. She wasn't arguing theory. She was stating facts from her own books. She had done the homework. She had the data, written in neat columns in Tom's old notebook, which was in her canvas bag at her feet. Miller was momentarily silenced. He was a man who dealt in bushels per acre and dollars per bushel. She had beaten him at his own game. He regrouped, shifting to his third and final argument, an attack on her credibility, an appeal to tradition and scale. He tried to portray her as an outlier, an anomaly whose results couldn't be trusted. That's fine for you, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. But it wouldn't work for the rest of us. It's not scalable. You can't run a modern, productive farm that way. You're talking about turning the clock back 50 years. We're trying to feed the world here, not tend a garden. He looked around the room for support and found some. A few of the older farmers nodded. What she was doing was different. It was unfamiliar. It felt like a risk they were too deep in debt to take. The bank attorney, who had been watching the exchange with the detached interest of a spectator at a tennis match, saw his opening. He stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking on the concrete. Mr. Miller makes a valid point, he said, his voice smooth and reasonable. The bank's primary concern is yield and revenue. We have to be confident that our clients' methods are commercially viable on a large scale. He turned to Sarah, a placating smile on his face. Mrs. Croft, your efforts are admirable, truly. But the model has to be proven. At this point, no one was looking at the banker. They were all looking at a man who had been sitting silently in the corner for the entire meeting. Old Man Peterson. He was the county extension agent, a job he had held for 40 years. He was past retirement age, but he stayed on because he loved the work. He had a reputation for being quiet, for being fair, and for knowing more about the soil in this county than any man alive. He was the neutral verifier. Peterson slowly stood up. He was a tall, stooped man with glasses thick as bottle bottoms. He pushed them up his nose and looked at the banker, then at Miller and finally at Sarah. He cleared his throat. The room held its breath. Peterson didn't speak right away. He walked from his chair in the corner to the front of the room, his gait slow and deliberate. He stopped beside the banker's portable lectern but didn't touch it. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the faces of the men he had known for decades. He had advised their fathers. He had seen good years and bad. He had seen droughts before, though none this relentless. When he finally spoke, his voice was raspy and used. I've been walking the fields in this county since 1972. He let that sink in. He had more experience than anyone in the room combined. I've seen soil turn from black loam to pale dust. I've seen organic matter drop from 4% to less than 1%. We've been treating the ground like a checking account with no overdraft protection. For a long time, the chemicals and the big equipment made up for it. The yields stayed high, so nobody looked down. Nobody looked at the structure, at the life in the soil, or the lack of it. He turned his head and looked directly at Miller. Frank, your father was a good farmer. He did what he thought was best, what everyone told him was best. But the methods of 1980 don't work in the climate of today. The safety net is gone. Miller's face was unreadable. He stood his ground, but the certainty had gone out of his posture. Peterson then turned his gaze to Sarah. I walked Sarah Croft's farm last Tuesday. I took a soil probe with me. He paused, letting the weight of his actions settle in the room. Her topsoil is friable, full of aggregation. You can smell the life in it. He held up his thumb and forefinger, about an inch apart. She's got earthworms the size of night crawlers. I haven't seen worms like that in a cornfield around here in 30 years. Then he delivered the final, decisive piece of evidence. The ground everywhere else is powder dry down a foot or more. On her land, I pushed the probe in. At 6 inches, the soil was still cool. It was still dark. It was holding moisture. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each farmer one by one. Her field stayed green because she gave it a reason to. She built a reservoir that you can't see, and it's holding more water than any irrigation pivot could ever pump. He stopped talking. The silence that followed was profound. It was the sound of an entire paradigm shifting. It was the sound of decades of confident assumption crumbling into dust. Peterson had not offered an opinion. He had delivered a testimony. He had been the witness for the soil itself. The banker was the first to recover. He was a man skilled at adapting to new information, at finding the winning side and joining it. His smile returned, wider this time, more genuine. "Well," he said, his voice bright, "this is fascinating. Truly remarkable. Mrs. Croft, you are to be commended." He saw a new opportunity, a new story to tell his superiors. A story of innovation, of a partnership with a forward-thinking farmer. "Perhaps," he said, directing his words to Sarah, "the bank could sponsor a field day at your farm. A demonstration. You could share your techniques with your neighbors. Help everyone get through this drought." It was a classic institutional maneuver. Co-opt the victory. Turn the quiet, individual success into a public relations event that the institution could control. Make her a symbol, and in doing so, neutralize the radical simplicity of her challenge. He was trying to put her in charge of their education, to shift the burden of their failure onto her. Sarah looked at the banker. She looked at the faces of her neighbors, now full of a dawning, desperate hope. They were looking at her as if she had a secret, a magic formula they could copy. They wanted a shortcut to the place she had reached after 5 years of patient, solitary work. She picked up the canvas bag at her feet. She stood. "I don't have any secrets," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Everything I did, I learned from a book. A pamphlet from the university, printed in 1978. Tom had it. The information has been there all along. In the library, in the extension office, right here." She gestured to a dusty rack of pamphlets in the corner of the co-op hall that no one had looked at in years. She was not going to be their teacher. She was not going to give them a tour. She had not done this for them. She had done it for the land and for Tom. If they wanted to learn, they could do their own homework. They could read for themselves. She said nothing more. She simply turned and walked toward the door. The resolution was not in the banker's offer or in the farmer's changed expressions. It was in her quiet refusal. Her refusal to perform her victory for them. Her refusal to let them turn her patient work into a spectacle. The dignity was in walking away. She did not look back. The meeting dissolved without officially ending. Men stood up, scraping their chairs on the concrete. They avoided looking at Miller, who remained standing, looking at nothing at all. They left one by one, not talking, each man alone with his thoughts, with the sudden, heavy knowledge that the dust covering his fields was a choice he had made, year after year. The banker, left alone at the front of the room, slowly packed his leather briefcase. He was already composing the email he would send to his regional manager, framing this not as a problem, but as an opportunity for a new green lending initiative. Every story could be spun. Sarah stepped out of the co-op hall into the searing late afternoon light. The wind was blowing, as always, carrying with it the smell of dust and defeat. She untied the canvas bag from her saddle and carefully placed a small, glass mason jar inside. It was filled with dark, rich, clumpy soil from her North 40. She had brought it just in case. She hadn't needed to show it. Peterson had spoken for it. She walked to her old pickup truck, the paint faded by decades of sun. She opened the door, the metal hot to the touch, and slid onto the cracked vinyl seat. She started the engine, and it turned over with a familiar, reassuring rumble. She did not hurry. She pulled out onto the gravel road and drove home, her island of green waiting for her in the distance. The victory was not a feeling of triumph. It was a feeling of quiet, settled rightness. The kind of feeling that comes not from winning an argument, but from knowing you didn't need to argue in the last place. The truth had its own pace. It had taken 5 years to grow. That evening, She sat on the porch swing, watching the sun set. The sky was a blaze of orange and purple, a beautiful, cruel spectacle in a rainless world. The line between her property and Miller's was stark. Her soybean field on the right was a deep, healthy green, the leaves full and open to the last of the light. His field on the left was a pale, yellowish-brown, the plants stunted, the ground between the rows bare and cracked. The difference was not subtle. It was a verdict written across the landscape. The screen door creaked open behind her. Her son, Ben, came out holding 2 steaming mugs. He had been living in the city working as a mechanic, but had come home a month ago to help, though she had never asked him to. He handed her a mug. It was tea the way she liked it. He sat down in the old wooden rocking chair beside the swing, the one that had been his father's. They sat in silence for a long time, a comfortable quiet that had grown between them over the years. He had his father's hands, but her quiet way of watching the world. He had been at the meeting. He had stood in the back and listened to the whole thing. He didn't ask her how it went. He didn't need to. He just looked out at the fields, the green one and the brown one. Dad would have liked to see this, he said finally, his voice low. A simple statement. It held everything. The years of Tom's worry, the quiet vindication of this moment, the grief and the pride all wound together. Sarah took a sip of her tea. The warmth spread through her chest. She looked at the field, her field, and saw not just the result of her work, but the continuation of a promise. A conversation that had been interrupted by death was now, in a way, complete. Some men collect problems. She collected patience. It was the only thing that grew in a drought. Some things are planted for the next man, she said, her voice barely a whisper on the evening air. She felt a sense of peace settle over her, as deep and as nourishing as a long, slow rain. It wasn't over. The drought would continue. The hard work would be there tomorrow. But something had been restored. Something had been set right. The land remembered. Patience has a long memory. So do county records. Next time we go to a small town in Oregon, where a retired librarian noticed something strange on a property deed from 1948. A single sentence about a water right that a multimillion-dollar bottling company had assumed was theirs for the taking. We'll see what holds.